Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Facebook Live where we're going to be deconstructing the budget with our friend Busi Sibeko. And welcome, Busi. It's nice for you to be able to join us on this Monday morning to talk about such deep things.
Thank you for having
So
me.
Sure. So what we'd like to talk about this morning is, the national budget speech is such an important event for us. Every year we get excited. We all talk about it. There's lots of media coverage. What is the minister going to say? But this year was, a real balancing act. If you look at the impact of the pandemic on the economy, the job losses from the resulting lockdowns, and the need to find money to fund all the vaccines that we need as well. So the minister was really in a tough situation, and for young people it's not always easy to understand everything that was said, and to follow why it's important for young people, and if how do young people get involved in being critical of the budget or having their voices taken into account and their opinions and lived experiences taken into account in the budget. So just a reminder to the audience that you please feel free to post comments throughout the discussion. But maybe just to get started, Busi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi to everyone who's joining this morning. My name is Busi Sibeko, and I'm an economist and researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. I'm also the co-chair of the Budget Justice Coalition, which is a coalition of 16 plus organizations that are fighting for, economic justice, budget justice. And yeah, I don't know what more people want to know about me. I mean, obviously I'm an economist by training, and yeah, this is the work that I do, and keenly interested in feminist economics as a way of understanding the world and thinking differently about economics, because the economics I've learned is not very helpful in understanding the real world, and it doesn't give the correct solutions. And so I understand, with your viewers as well, that there's an economics we've been taught. We took EMS, when we were in high school. Maybe we took economics in high school. Some of us maybe took it in university, but still don't feel that it is sufficient, to understand the real world that we live in, our real experiences.
Thanks, Busi. I think you're spot on, and a nice kind of follow-up to that is, how did we get here? Every year we have a national budget and a medium-term budget, and we speak about things as though they're all new, but often it feels like we're hearing, the same thing every year. So, we feel that there often isn't a reflection on what has been accomplished with the last year's budget. We just hear, we're going to be spending another 11 billion on this thing. So how can we follow what has been delivered in previous budget speeches?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. As people know, the South African budget sort of works on a 3-year cycle, right? There's the medium-term expenditure framework, and then there's the yearly budget. But the timelines are very interesting because these things are happening concurrently. It's almost like while you are in this 3-year motion, you're also having these yearly updates. So the yearly budget comes in February, and it's usually on the 3rd week of the month. And then the medium-term expenditure framework, which gives you the 3-year projections. This is our framework of how we're going to follow the budget for 3 years. Usually happens in October. And so these two are very critical, right? Because those are sort of the moments, like you've already outlined, where we hear what is going to be happening with the budget. So in terms of following the budget, a lot of this information is available on the National Treasury website. So South Africa's government, ranks quite highly in terms of budget transparency. And so a lot of these documents are available. And very importantly, there are also documents at the provincial level. So if you're actually interested at what your province is doing, these documents should be available on your province's websites. Although we have noticed that in the last year, the provincial budgets were not published during COVID, which is concerning for transparency, of course, as you can imagine. But I think for people to understand and follow as well is there's a document, it's called the SCOA, and I'm blanking on what it stands for, but the SCOA document tells you how the budget has actually been spent. So that's also another key document that can be found on the National Treasury website. So I'm saying that, in terms of following what's happening what's happened. A lot of this data is available online, but obviously now, on the flip side, it's a question of how people understand, is it accessible? Is the actual document accessible? Is a very different conversation, because as we already said, the budget itself is not written for the average citizen. The budget itself is written to appease the credit ratings agencies. It's written to appease the market. So it's not being written for, average South African to be able to read and understand everything. So yeah, those are sort of like the two issues. You can follow it. The documents exist. The challenge on the other side is whether they are accessible and if you're able to meaningfully engage with the content, and then what do you do with that content, which we can also discuss.
Yeah, so I think that leads perfectly into, the next thing I wanted to ask you is these terminology. There's lots of jargony words that get thrown around in the budget speech. I myself, who, I'm a health economist actually by training, very different, and I struggle to follow it. So, how do we kind of break down some of that language? And I think if you could start with, talking about austerity. Minister Mboweni spoke a lot about austerity in this budget, and every year it's mentioned. So maybe could you explain what austerity means in this budget context, maybe specifically, and did this budget promote austerity?
Yeah, very good question. And I think the minister actually speaking about it in his budget, in his speech, has popularized the word even more than it was probably before this. But okay, so there's two concepts that I think people need to understand. The one is fiscal consolidation, right? And fiscal consolidation means that you are shrinking your budget, like you are cutting your budget, right? And fiscal consolidation, this is the concept, can happen in two ways. Fiscal consolidation, cutting the budget, can happen when your economy is growing, and it can happen when your economy is not growing. When your economy is growing, it is fine. It's good. When your economy is not growing, it is austerity. That is actually one of the key distinctions. There's fiscal consolidation and there's austerity. And austerity is when you cut the budget or implement regressive taxes. And by regressive taxes, we're talking about taxes that benefit the wealthy over the poor, right? During a period of low growth, right? So it's very critical. During a period of low growth, and the rationale for doing that is to deal with your debt problems. So you are cutting budget or increasing regressive taxes, which is shrinking the economy, right? To deal with debt during a period of debt. So those are the very key components, right? Cutting budgets, regressive taxes during a period of low growth, and four, to deal with debt. That is basically the simplified definition, because of course the economists have written extensively on this, and some others would add other things. So they would add, the failure to upkeep public expenditure or, public spending during particular periods of time. So there are expanded definitions that many economists have come to, but I think that is the most critical baseline understanding.
That's great. I think for me personally, that made it a lot clearer. And I think you raised this issue of debt. So in the context of this budget, from my limited understanding, I understand that austerity measures are important because South Africa's debt is a really large sum of money. But maybe you just want to add and elaborate why in the context of this year's budget, austerity is important.
Yeah. So I mean, austerity is important to the government. Let's be clear. It's not important. Well, it's important to me because they're implementing it, but I don't endorse the decision. And so again, here, there's also two concepts that are very important, because there's debt as in like our total debt, we've got X amount of debt. I think they're, projecting it to increase significantly to the 90%, right? We've got debt, and then there's debt servicing costs. Debt servicing costs is like, what you pay, how you service your debt. What do you need to pay on a monthly basis? Well, it wouldn't be monthly because it's the national budget, but what you need to pay back that loan. So it's the interest you're paying. It's the loan, how you need to pay it over time. It's almost like a house. I don't like comparing the national budget to a household because it's very different. But it's almost like, if you have a bond, the total debt is the debt, and then your debt servicing costs are what you're paying to service that bond over time, right? So those are two key things to consider in the South African in the South African context, right? So our total debt is a ratio to GDP. So when we think about debt, we don't say, you know, we say South Africa owes however much in absolute terms the money is. But when people compare it, it's always relative to GDP. It's always relative to how big is our economy, right? And so what happens is people think if your debt is too big or is as big as your economy, you know, people think as their household, like, oh my gosh, if I owe the bank my house, they're going to take my house. You know, like we think that way, but that's not really how it happens, because there's generally no agreed upon rate at which, you know, debt is too large. The problem is the debt servicing costs. There are countries that have over 100% debt to GDP ratios. United States, Japan, I think is at 200%, right? It's not that matters. It's your ability to grow your economy, right? To be able to service that debt. And so I'm going to try to do this. I've been saying I'm going to do this illustration for a while. So now I think today I've got the props for it. So if I've got this, I'm going to print circles. So if this is your GDP, right? Like this paper is your GDP. And this is effectively your debt to GDP, right? Your debt to GDP is this big. This is what's happening. Our government is shrinking this, which is our economy, right? But what happens when you shrink this? Let's say you shrink it to the size. Your debt to GDP increases as a share, right? It doesn't decrease this. This is still large. The way to decrease this ratio is to grow, right? To grow your economy ultimately. And so that is the key issue that we have with the debt to GDP issue, and the way that it's been framed. The way National Treasury is telling us is that if they shrink, you know, their spend, which is a significant part of the size of our economy depends on it. 30% of our economy is government spend. So they're going to shrink that, and what's going to happen is the debt to GDP ratio is actually going to increase, right? So it's counterintuitive in a way, but yeah. So those are the debt and debt servicing costs that people need to understand.
Sure, that was life-changing for me. I don't know about anybody else out there, but I've never had it explained like that. That was a great illustration, actually. I never understood why it was bad. So thanks so much for clearing that up, Busi. And I think we've touched on fiscal consolidation already. And I don't know if you want to maybe expand on it a little. You know, how can government achieve fiscal consolidation? Because I think you've already explained what it is, but maybe how can government achieve it?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said, I don't think fiscal consolidation is what we should be doing, right? Like they're going to do it because National Treasury has decided that this is the route that they want to go. They've already significantly cut the budget. In fact, over the next 3 years, the budget is going to be non-interest expenditure. Non-interest expenditure is spent on everything but debt, is actually going to, in real terms. So that means when you adjust for inflation, like, so what is your R1 worth? It's going to decline by 5.2%. So over the next 3 years, we're going to see massive cuts, education, health, everything. Our basic services are going to, you know, the amounts being allocated to provinces, to municipalities, to these functions is going to decline significantly. And I think fundamentally, this fiscal consolidation project, in a way, depends a lot on whether National Treasury wins with regards to the public sector wage bill, right? Because it hinges on that. So if public servants win the cases and so forth going forward, it actually means that then National Treasury can't implement those massive cuts to compensation to those workers themselves. And so yeah, so it's a bit tricky because it hinges fundamentally on that. And so we'll see what happens over the next couple of weeks, months, with regards to that. But yeah, the only way it will be successful is if they win these cases.
Sure, tough times. Just a reminder to anybody watching that they are free to post comments throughout and questions throughout, and we'll filter that through to Busi as well. So maybe a last terminology question before we get into the nuts and bolts of this year's budget. is what is zero-based budgeting? We've heard this thrown around a lot, but maybe you can unpack that a little for us, please.
Yeah, so zero-based budgeting, is an old word, if you can think of it that way. There are a lot of countries that consider this. It's very popular in the business world. It basically says that there are no standing allocations. So right now, how our budget is set up, it says X amount has been set for health, and then over time, this X amount is going to increase, right? And so there are functions that are there. They are part of the fabric. Like, so every year we're going to allocate, this much, and it's going to grow this much in terms of compensation, for example, right? We're going to pay this much teachers and so forth. So zero-based budgeting basically says you must go and have rigorous analysis, and every year you have to justify all those projects. No project is guaranteed that it can stay in a way. So every year we'd have to justify why the TB program must remain the TB program. Every year they'd have to justify why we need to hire X amount of teachers and so forth. But zero-based budgeting is problematic in many ways, right? Because we are in a country where there is a constitution that says that, right, that we have rights, we need to have those rights implemented and so forth. And so actually, if we were to challenge National Treasury, would be to say, what would it cost to deliver on human rights? So in fact, I'd argue that zero-based budgeting, if done correctly in the South African context, would lead to a much bigger budget than what we actually have now, because it would ultimately identify the needs, which are way greater than the budget is right now, right? People, are living in places with no roads. So if we were going to do it right, in fact, the budget would expand rapidly, and that's not what. So National Treasury is using zero-based budgeting to implement austerity, right? But actually, if we're going to do zero-based budgeting properly, would say these are our needs, and this is how much we need to be allocating to get there. But I think fundamentally, my last comment on this is to say that zero-based budgeting won't solve the issues that we really face. Zero-based budgeting says Busi, who's a municipal leader in a small town somewhere, is unable to justify, right, why there should be roads in that town, right? But I'm the municipal leader. I'm the one who's unable to justify. It doesn't mean the people in my area need that road less, right? It hinges on who is implementing. And in fact, in South Africa, we've got a huge problem around this. We cutting budgets does not solve the failures of implementation. That's not what solves it. It just deprives the people who need those resources. It does. It hits them hardest. Instead of saying, how do we resolve it so that this money gets to the people? And that our government is saying, we are taking away the money completely. So that's also some of the fundamental issues with zero-based budgeting. It ultimately punishes the people who are supposed to be recipients of that money, because it's all about these middle people, the people who are supposed to be doing the implementation.
Yeah, and I think you raise a really important point. We know in South Africa we've got great policies, we've got a wonderful constitution. It's at the point of implementation and monitoring and evaluation that we fall down again and again and again. And then, as you say, what happens as a result of that is money gets cut, funding gets cut, programs get cut because they're not working. Instead of saying, well, actually, this is why they weren't working, and without extra money we could actually make them work amazingly. With us, from our point of youth capital, we often will say that money for youth development and creating youth employment is not a problem. If we actually summed up how much we spent on it, I think we'd be shocked. Like, if we really looked at the numbers, there are billions and billions being spent on youth employment. The problem is, how do we go about that? Have we consulted young people in that? Have we thought through what it really means for that person in a community where there aren't roads, where they don't have internet? What does it mean for that young person to have access to an opportunity that's a stepping stone into a career path? We need to start thinking like that. We can't keep doing these top-down policy approaches and having these wonderfully written policies with these great, lofty ideas that in practice never amount to anything for the people they're meant to serve. So I couldn't agree with you more. But maybe in the last half of our chat, and I'll leave some time at the end in case there's anything you want to add. So maybe we could just work through this year's budget. Maybe we'd start with something that I personally think is going to be a short answer. What did this year's budget say about education?
Oh, it's bad.
I would have to agree with you on that one.
It's bad. So, you know, the budget is obviously, again, like I said, there are massive cuts across the board. For the next years, you know, the next 3 years, let me give you a context, right? So if our government was spending 20,300 Rand per learner on basic education in 2019, 2020, by 2022-23, they'll be spending 1,751 Rand less, right?
Sure.
We also know that between 2010, 2019, per learner spending declined by 8%. So our government has actually been systematically decreasing how much they're spending per student, right? And in fact, this is part of that issue of fiscal consolidation that has been happening since 2012. People don't know this, but if you go to the budgets, even in 2012, they said to us, we've got this debt problem, we must reduce spend, we must do this. So they've been systematically actually cutting spend for a very long time. And now it's just being accelerated in the next 3 years. And so as you can imagine, this is going to massively impact learners, right? You know, it's very sad and very concerning because in the budget itself, and I'll never forget this page because that's how shocking it is. It's on page 59 of this budget review. They effectively say that they understand that these cuts to the compensation bill, right, like the lot paying the teachers, and all these retirement packages that they're giving to teachers and all these things are going to result in overcrowded classrooms, right? And there's going to be a shortage of teachers. They acknowledge that there's going to be a shortage of teachers. There's going to be overcrowded classrooms because they're not going to be investing the money they need to invest. And they acknowledge that it's going to impact no fee paying schools more, right? Yet this is the
They're
budget.
doing it.
Yes, they're doing it. It's like, oh, sorry, like it's going to be bad for you, but like,
Yeah.
but this really goes to speak to just like, is this constitutionally correct, right? What about people's rights to education? Which is why it's important that we link our budget fundamentally to the constitution, right? Because it's supposed to progressively realize, right, to make bet or reach people's rights over time. We understand that, you know, there's complexities and so forth, but actually the UN in 2018 said South Africa had the resources to immediately realize the right to education for all. So in fact, we can do that, right? And this budget is going to really harm is the word, because obviously we know all these things linked to education. We know the intergenerational impact of a poor education, the inequality that's being perpetuated in this budget. So yeah, it's very concerning in terms of education in particular.
And I think I love the point you raised around inequality. You know, we've seen throughout the pandemic how it has exacerbating existed inequalities and failures of government, and it has really shone a spotlight on those problems and those inequalities. And I think education has really been an example of that. If we look at how the learners in, you know, as you say, no fee paying schools, so your quintile 1 to 3, which is in layman's terms your poorer schools, have been worst hit by school closures because schools that are more resourced in quintile 5 probably actually, they continue to learn online. They come from homes where they have devices, they have Wi-Fi, their teachers have Wi-Fi and devices. And those, I mean, I know from just talking to people, many resourced schools in wealthier areas continue to learn online even during the hard lockdown. Whereas once again, learners who were in poorer schools were the ones who bore the brunt of the learning losses of the year. You know, the latest stats say we're going to take up to 8 years to get back to where we were before COVID hit in terms of the level of education we were providing. And how does that projection get impacted by a reducing budget spend on education? I think it's important for people to know that even as an absolute number, if you're decreasing the value, or even if you're staying at the same value, or, you know, spend per learner, you are decreasing it because of inflation. And, you know, because of COVID, inflation is on the rise. Costs of things are increasing, food, for example. And we know our learners were hit by lack of school feeding schemes with COVID. And so, you know, all of these things will be impacted, as you say, by these, you know, this fiscal consolidation approach. And people that will be worst hit are the ones who can least afford it. And as you said, it's not just for this generation, but we know how education has this intergenerational effect, and how, like, what can we do to fix that? I mean, there's still schools with pit latrines, which I always kind of raise
Yeah.
as this like ridiculous notion that in 2021, in a country like South Africa, which, as you say, has the means to do something about it, we just haven't gotten it right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's a question coming in from Facebook, so I maybe just want to take a break to just cover the question. They say the minister repeatedly said that this budget is not an example of austerity because there is money for grants. Were we misled? Over to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What is frustrating is this denialism. There's an austerity denialism happening, and part of the reason why it's happening is fundamentally because we know austerity is a political project, right? It's not just a technical exercise. Our government has a duty to deliver on human rights and to make sure that in our country that they follow the constitution, but they are deciding, deciding to implement this austerity. And in terms of the social grants, I think we're going to come back to it later, but maybe I can even start answering it here. Is to say that, yes, the social grants increased in terms of like the absolute value. So the money that, we see that it's increasing, but actually when you look at it in relation to what you call it, to inflation, they're actually decreasing. And I think I had the numbers here for you. So even in this year, even though the child support grant, for instance, is increasing, like if you compare, initially it was 445 and it's going to go to 460. So naturally would say the increase is 3.47%, right? It's 3.47%, yeah. But what's actually happening is that when you subtract inflation, or consider inflation, it's actually decreasing by negative 0.8%. So your R1 today is not the same worth R1 tomorrow because there's inflation, right? What you could buy, we know this, prices of bread go up, things go up because there's inflation. But what's happening is this amount is not increasing to take into account inflation. So across the social grants as well, there's just a decline, and especially with the child grants, it's always concerning because the child grant at 460 next year even is still significantly below the food poverty line. The food poverty line in South Africa is 585 Rand, and for children it's actually more. For children to have the nutrition they need, it requires more than 585 Rand, and this grant falls significantly short of that. So, even when we talk about grants, I think it's always important to contextualize of what does the grant itself buy you? Is it, at the food poverty line at least, and so forth. So those are critical things. Grants don't mean that, there's no austerity. What's another thing? Somebody said in another platform I was in, like, oh, it's not austerity because the cuts aren't as bad as they were meant to be in the medium-term expenditure framework. So I'm like, okay, so we're going to create a new definition for austerity in South Africa. Like, if we think about the definition which I outlined earlier, is that what we're doing? Yes.
Yes.
That's what we're doing. We're cutting budgets and we are implementing regressive taxes. The wealthy are the ones who are walking away happy in this budget. Corporates are going to get a tax reduction. They're happy in this budget. The poor, what are the poor getting? Do you see what I mean? And so it's fundamentally important that we go back to this definition. What is austerity? And I think it's important that we ask ourselves, why does our minister feel so strongly about saying it is not austerity? And that's the critical question for me.
Why does he keep saying that if it's, everybody is kind of apparent that it is? And on this issue of grants, as you said, we were gonna cover it. So maybe I think let's just segue into that. Something we've been very concerned about with Youth Capital, if you look at the research coming out of the NIDS CRAM study, which is the biggest survey that was conducted over the lockdown period, what we're seeing is that young women have been worst hit by the pandemic, and they've been further disadvantaged because one of the requirements of getting the social relief distress grant, that 350 rand that government made available in response to the effects of lockdown, you can't access it if you're accessing another social grant. So there are many young women in this country who are accessing child support grants, but that money is for their child. It's not for them. So if they lost income as a result of COVID, the amount of the stories of mothers going hungry to feed their children over last year is heartbreaking. And how is government accounting for that? So again, as you say, Busi, it's important for us as young people to interrogate these things and to say, don't you kind of, tell us that it's all unicorn and rainbows, as I like to say, with there's grants, we've given you more money, things are good, we've extended the social relief distress grant, but actually, what does that mean for a young woman who has a child? What does that mean for young people? And I think it's important for us to interrogate that and look at what does that mean. And especially as there's conversations around the rollout of a more generalized basic income grant, what are the tenets we would need to take into account to make that grant really, really life-changing for people who need it? And to make sure that people who need access to it have access, and that it's an amount that can make a difference. So, yeah, Busi, I don't know if you want to add any commentary on the basic income grant, or this discrepancy we've seen with young women really being disadvantaged over the period, compared to if we just compare them to their male counterparts.
Yeah, no, that's a very serious issue, and one that, even in the Budget Justice Coalition, the Institute for Economic Justice, is something we've repeatedly raised. But, fundamentally, why is it that this is happening is because we have government policy, economic policy, by tradition, the way that it's taught is gender blind. It assumes that everybody will be impacted in the same ways, right? And it's fundamentally problematic because in South Africa, we know that, on average, the most poor people, or rather that poverty has a face, it is female, it is young, and it is in the Eastern Cape. Actually, we even have the geographical location, right? So we understand, if you look at the poverty survey, the inequality study that was done in South Africa, we know we've got these stats, we know who is significantly, disproportionately impacted. And so our budget is supposed to respond to those issues, right? Our budget is supposed to respond to these deep inequalities and remedy them, not entrench them further. Right. And that's why I'm saying that this budget is deepening inequality in many ways. And it's the same with the SRD, right? The COVID grant. It is that gender blindness, right, that is excluding mothers from this, right? It's almost like, it's across board, right? It's across our macroeconomic policy. How do we think about tax and the disproportional impacts of tax? For even on men's side, I guess, if you could say it like that, like this increase in alcohol tax impacts households differently, depending on whether it's a male-headed household or female-headed household, right? And if it's a heterosexual household, because we also need to be intersectional in how we understand households themselves. But even that, like not acknowledging what that will do in a context of COVID. I don't think our government has assessed sufficiently to say that this tax increase will not disproportionately impact certain households more than others. This is a fundamental problem across all of economic policy, if I could put it that way, if I could put it simply, in the same that it doesn't necessarily consider youth adequately, in the same way that it doesn't, so it's across intersections, and we have to understand these intersections of oppression. And the reason why I'm for a universal basic income grant is because then you take away these exclusionary mechanisms. Yes, it's going to assume almost a neutral impact, but then there are ways to deal with that, right? Like, so what are we trying to resolve is ultimately the issue, and what tools? It's almost like you need to think of, when you're cooking, you're not going to use a fork for everything, like you're going to use a spoon here. So the question is, what are we trying to resolve, and how do we think of multiple tools to resolve those issues? And a universal basic income grant, one, is easier to implement in the South African context, where we know that, the more red tape you have, the more room for corruption also, right?
Yeah. It's the opposite of what they intended.
Yeah, so the simpler we can implement something, the better. And in fact, it should target 18 to 59, which is the group that is traditionally not included. It should be universal. It should ensure people's basic access to services. It should be ideally in the upper bound poverty line, at least. But you know what we've put forward is to say right now, at least it must be the food poverty line of 585 Rand. But in the long run, it should move towards a living wage, because fundamentally all humans should have access to their basic needs, whether they're able to or unable to work, whether there are jobs, whether there are no jobs in the economy. It shouldn't matter. Like every human being, right, should have access to their basic goods. And that's the hill I'm willing to die on.
I fully hear you. And actually, there's a question that's come in, which I think touches on some of this. You said we don't just need a fork; we need a spoon and a knife and various other things. We live in a complex South Africa, but we've got to start somewhere. And so, a question that's come in is, do you think a tax increase is the best solution if we're looking at the state of our economy? And just another note, this person also said they don't believe that the stated inflation rate is correct. It should be higher. I think maybe we're all feeling that in our pockets. But maybe if you want to,
personally feeling that.
I think we all are, and now with petrol going up again, we're going to feel it even more. But
yes.
Yeah, so what do you think about tax increases? And I think this person probably means personal income tax, but maybe if you just want to comment on that question.
Yeah, and I'll start with the inflation thing. It's completely correct. If you look at the Pietermaritzburg PMEJD, I think Pietermaritzburg Economic and something justice. I never remember the full name, but it's very important. People like that do studies on what the food basket is costing over time. And so they've demonstrated that like the basket of goods for nutrition, for basic nutrition, has increased significantly in South Africa. So we also have to disaggregate data, because there's the headline inflation, but food price inflation is different from other types. This is the average. So our National Treasury, again, that's another key, actually very good point, because maybe social grants need to actually be increased in line with the food price inflation as opposed to the headline like general inflation, right? Or food price inflation of poor households, right? Because there's also disaggregated data to that level. And so I agree that there's a disconnect between what economics says we're experiencing versus what people are actually experiencing. And even for me personally, I think my shopping has increased. I think I was calculating the other day, like 50%, what I would usually buy, the basic goods that I'd buy, have increased significantly over this period in time. So it's a very critical issue. I think in terms of tax increases, I would only support tax increases that are distribution, right? Tax is a very key redistribution tool, and that's how we need to understand it. So I would be interested in tax increases for the wealthy. I'd be interested in taxing a resource rent tax. So you saw that commodities are doing very well right now. So how do we say that if commodities hit a certain price, those mining companies have to, pay more taxes, right? Fundamentally, I think, that I would only support tax increases that redistribute wealth and income. I think it's also important that we understand, and I can't unpack all of this now here, but to say that government, like how much government has, if we think of it that way, is very complex. And in fact, how our government is making it seem like we need tax to be able to afford things is fundamentally wrong. That's not how the economy works. Government's, resources, what they're able to provision for us and so forth, is not determined by tax exclusively, if you think of it that way, right? Tax has very different impacts. And again, like I won't unpack it here, but tax has impacts on the economy at large, and therefore what government has, in general, or what the economy looks like and so forth. But it is important that we don't do a one-to-one. We don't say to have education, we must tax more, because there's also other resources. Like I said, you need a spoon, a fork, a knife, all these things that we haven't even considered, right? Like there are so many other things. We need to think about what is the role of the South African Reserve Bank? What is the role of, how do we think about our government employment pension fund? How do we think about, there are other resources and public finances, generally in economics, that are deeply underutilized. And so it is important that we all understand there at home that it's not, if government doesn't tax more, then we won't get the things that we need, because fundamentally there is more the government could be doing. And when we do this thing, the one-to-one thing, what happens is government says, we have reached our threshold, we can't tax anymore. So then what does that mean? By default, it means we must accept that government cannot afford anything. And therefore the situation is what it is. And it's worked powerfully. This household national budget being compared to a household has worked as a powerful mechanism for making people believe that, you know, our government's hands are tied. But they're not in the ways that we think they are. And so it perpetuates austerity, it justifies austerity, it normalizes austerity, because then we all think, you're in my house and I don't have money, I have to cut budgets. But that's not what we should know about the budget or the economy at large. Someone the other day said to me, we must run the country like a business. And I was just like, no ways. Business logic is low cost, reduced costs, max profits. Like, I can't imagine why I would want to do that. Like, a country is not like a business, and it's important because the tools, again, like I'm saying, are so different. And the minute we get stuck in thinking the country should be like a business or the country should be like a household, what we do is we shut down all those other possible tools. We constrain what is possible, deeply constrain what is possible. So yeah, that's my take on that one.
No, I think that's yeah, a really, really valuable point. And I think it goes back to the point of this conversation, you know, how do we as young people understand the budget and unpack the budget if the metaphors and the explanations we've been given by the government are actually false ideologies and not a true reflection of how things work. And obviously, if you're not an economist, we just will assume that what they're saying is fact. So I think these conversations are really great. So thanks for making the time, Busi. And maybe to go back to some of the points about this year's budget, obviously health was top of their mind for most people. We were like, how are we, this vaccine debacle, what are we going to do with these extra vaccines that we now can't really use because they're not really great in the South African context? How much, you know, how is government going to get all the vaccines we need? So maybe you can unpack a little bit generally, you know, what was said about health in this year's budget.
Yeah, so as we know, which we welcome, even I welcome this. There's few things I usually praise the budget, the budget for doing. But one of the key things is obviously making those vaccine allocations is very important. We know that, you know, over the next 2-3 years, or the next 2 years rather, what they've allocated is about 8.2 billion rand towards the vaccine rollout. They've also added, these are the additions, they've also added 8 billion towards managing the second and the third waves of the crisis itself. But obviously I'd argue that, you know, the 8 billion is not enough. There are 9 provinces, so we are averaging less than 1 billion per province to manage the third wave, right? It's level 1 today. On my way to work this morning, there were so many cars outside. I am very terrified of what's going to happen now. You know, I feel like the whole of Joburg is moving somewhere. Or is it level 1? I don't know. So, but I think it's important to understand that even though these allocations for vaccines are being made, there were significant cuts to the health budget itself. And so these things, that what is the net effect? Right? If you are taking away some things and then giving some things, what is the net effect, that total impact? And so we're deeply worried about, you know, the reductions. There's 50.3 billion worth of reductions over the next 3 years. And so some of the programs, I'll give you an example. For instance, the planned spending on HIV, TB, malaria, and community outreach grant to provinces has been reduced by a total of 5.8 billion. Those are critical services. Those are so important, and obviously need to be contextualized as well within the compensation, you know, the public wage bill, because health is obviously a personnel heavy sector. And so those sorts of things are, yeah, it's concerning. Conditional grants in health, you know, for multiple programs, you know, which include, like, what do you call it? What did I want to say now? Other like cancer type of programs, oncology and so forth, are being reduced. And so this is mass. It's very worrying, because it's the question of, you know, are we sacrificing long-term health capabilities, you know, for the short term? And the short term is very, very important. Don't get me wrong. Like, we actually need both. That would be my argument. Yeah. We need to both have the vaccines, but two, we need to improve our health system. If anything, COVID has shown us that we need a proper healthcare service that is accessible to all, that is, of good quality. And currently we know for a long time, South Africa's health system has been overcrowded, underfunded. And, this budget is perpetuating that, right? The underfunding component, particularly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like you're saying, we're hearing reports about how the rate of diagnosis of TB has drastically gone down. What is the long-term effects of that? You have people spreading TB because they don't know they have it, because they're maybe too scared, because they know that their clinic's already overcrowded. They don't want to risk getting COVID, so they're staying at home, even though they should be seeking care. We know that access to antiretroviral drugs for those living with HIV has gone down. What are the long-term effects of that? We know if people default on medication, that medication can stop working, which can lead to that person getting very sick and possibly dying. We know that there have been reports in KZN, for example, where there was one oncologist in the public health system for the entire province. And this was before all of these cuts. So I think, as you say, it's important, like, this is a complex issue, but if we're going to engage with it, we have to look at the whole package. Yes, we need vaccines and a COVID response, but in the long term, what is needed to bolster our public health system? We've been talking about moving towards national health insurance for a number of years now. How are we ever going to get there if we can't fix these basic fundamentals and we have a shrinking budget? I think these are important things to consider. And then, in the last little bit of time that we have, really like to unpack some of the things that were mentioned in the budget speech around youth employment. Obviously, at Youth Capital, this is a key focus. It's why we tuned into the budget speech. It's what we were waiting for. And then I think there were 3 sentences on it. And we were disappointed. We know that there was, 11 billion being given towards employment creation, but what does that really mean? And so I don't know if you want to unpack a little bit around your thinking from an economist's point of view. We spoke about the presidential youth employment intervention. There's the economic stimulus package that's been extended now. We spoke about support to SMMEs and entrepreneurship support through the NYDA. And so I don't know if you want to take the last kind of 10 minutes or so to just chat through some of those things.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and I'm gonna try collapse all of them so that I don't go like everywhere. But I think the first thing to realize, I think it's important to understand that last year when the 500 billion was announced, which our research shows that only a third of it had been utilized by the budget. So we're looking at very small implementation, right? For a crisis of this nature. And so, our government still prides itself in the, one of the largest announced packages and so forth, but that's not really what happened. And 100 billion of that was supposed to be for job creation and and employment and so forth. So we know last year that only 12.6 billion, if we exclude the extension of the grants, which was the other 6 billion of that amount, was actually allocated to this, right? And the program, there's a lot of great results. The employment stimulus, I'm going to call it the implementation. The committee that's been running this, there's been mass implementation. They did implement it and use the money in, the ways that they were supposed to use it. But fundamentally, what we've argued is it's not nearly enough. Even that 12.6 billion last year was not enough. And now we know that 11 billion has been added to it, right? So now you must ask yourself, what happened to the 100 billion? That was what was really firstly announced. So why is it being reduced significantly? And it's really deeply concerning because, as you know, we are in a deep unemployment crisis. Unemployment now stands at 11.1 million people, the expanded definition, and that's very important, right? So there is no jobs bounce back as initially been thought, right? And people are losing jobs, and we also know this is gendered, right? So it's not just everybody's losing jobs. There's some people are losing more, and Black women in particular losing more jobs, right? And so that's the first thing. And also there's, the reason why our president, or rather our minister, says this is not an austerity budget is because ultimately they think, or they're calling it a pro-growth fiscal consolidation, right? So ultimately this all hinges on the fact that growth will be significantly higher than the cuts, which is unlikely. I mean, unless if we think, our economy is really gonna, even if we're to to compare it. If we think our economy is going to go by 5.2% in the next 3 years, but still, that the hurt would have been done in real terms. The hurt would have been done to the economy because it will deepen inequality ultimately, right? So yes, even if we did grow a pro-growth, what kind of growth are we wanting? A deeply unequal growth? That's what's going to happen, right? Even if there is growth, there's going to be a deeply unequal growth with all these other cuts that are happening. So, but I mean, my argument has always been that the fiscal consolidation or austerity is going to harm the economy more. And in fact, in the budget 2020 review, they did say that cutting the budget to this extent is actually going to harm basic services and is going to harm the economy. So you can only imagine that for youth, it's only going to get worse, you know? So it's contradictory in many ways, because it's like we're doing this and it's going to be pro-growth, but also acknowledging that it's going to harm the economy and harm basic services. And so those are some of the key things to think about. But also importantly, you know, the state is reducing funding for industrial policy interventions that are crucial to expanding labor-intensive sectors in our economy, right? Our government is not investing enough in these sectors, right? So, you know, employment creation programs, including public works, are allocated a small amount of 33.4 billion if you count all of them together in 2021, 2022, which is actually, you know, and they're declining. Over the years, over the next 3 years, we're going to decline or reduce the amount that we're spending on employment creation programs, right? Industrializations and exports are also, you know, being declined. So totally, if we think about all these initiatives, they're less than 5% of our budget.
Sure, that's shocking.
Right?
Yeah. And
there's allocations to supporting production in various sectors, you know, so it's again, it's that I'll keep going back to this. What are the net effects? The net effects, what kind of growth is this inducing? It's creating a more enabling environment or business environment, but for who? And who's paying the costs, right? It is, you know, those youth who need these employment creation opportunities. And even those opportunities, also another hot debate there. It's 800 opportunities is not necessarily jobs. We don't know, you know, it'll be different if we're saying we're going to create 800 steady jobs in the next year. Then I'll be a very different conversation. But even 800,000 jobs is not enough. So I think it goes back to the question of what is the role of the government in our economy? And if we don't agree on this, if we are not honest about what is it that we expect, and if we can't agree, we can't have the right policy prescriptions, because the policy prescriptions, this budget is clear that it is saying private sector take the wheel. Characterize it. It's saying private sector take the wheel. We are just going
we out.
We out. You guys can see how you resolve. I know you've got one more question for me, but I think one thing that I forgot to add, and that's very important, is that in South Africa, even if the jobs were being created, in South Africa, it is important that we acknowledge that, you know, while unemployment is a strong driver of poverty, people in our country who work are also earning so little that it is driving poverty, right? So in 2015, there was a study that showed 54% of full-time workers earned below the working poverty line of 4,125 Rand, right, per month.
Yeah.
What does that mean for households? It means that even if you create all the employment you want in the world, if people are not earning enough, it is why we're going to have this like multiple or impact, triple impact, right? Because if I'm the only wage earner in my household, right, and I'm living with a child and an elderly, we actually need that money to sustain our households, because I'm not earning enough to be able to take care of the household. So it's very important that we think differently as well as we think about employment, particularly youth employment. We think employment is the solution out, but actually what happens is that we then in these low-paying jobs that are precarious and low-paying opportunities and, you know, short-term opportunities, continuous struggle. And so fundamentally, it's important that when we think about this budget, we think about how does it lay the frameworks for decent work, for actual decent work, right? With wages that is not precarious, that protects workers, that ensures that actually it reduces poverty in general, and it is intersectional. It takes into account women, youth, you know, and so forth. So that's the last point I wanted to leave. Well, in terms of this, when we talk about employment and how government one is not supporting the sectors it should be supporting, but in addition to think about, employment generally in the South African context, that even when it is there, we are still poor. And so that is very important to consider in the context.
Absolutely, Busi, and I have so much I could say, and I think we could probably keep talking for half an hour, but we're going to be respectful of people's time and the fact that we said we were going to have this conversation for 1 hour. So, I think all that in everything that you've said, the alarm bells in my head at Youth Capital are really like, so what do young people do about it? How do we kind of have an impact on these decisions that Treasury is making? How do we make sure they hear our voices and hear us saying that this is not going to work for the people of South Africa, particularly it's not going to work for young South Africans who you are expecting to take this country forward, who are at risk of being a lost generation because of COVID. That's what a lot of research is saying internationally as well. What can young people do? How can we contribute to this and impact on these decisions?
Yeah, difficult question. They're always the most difficult question. I think there's many things, because I think there are multiple ways of thinking of it. One of it is, as young people, we have to mobilize. We have to have a collective voice that calls for our cabinets, for our MPs to reject budgets. I feel like that is fundamentally something that hasn't happened in South Africa since 1990. I don't think there's been a rejection of a budget. And I think it's important that, we come to a point where we say, this is not working for us. National Treasury, you said you're going to be cutting you're going to reduce the debt since 2012. Why haven't you reduced it? And I think part of it is we need to start asking questions more. Where's the 500 billion? Where is it? We need to start actually holding them to account. But holding them to account is not a one-person job. That's what my job is. My work is around this work. But even then, my voice alone as a young person in South Africa is not enough. We need a collective voice that says, you have to account to us, right? Like the National Treasury is, the supreme law is the Constitution. National Treasury functions under that, but ultimately it's supposed to serve us, the people. And how do we collectively do that? And I think, there are many things that people can join. There are many amazing campaigns. Amandla is running a wealth tax campaign. The Assembly of the Unemployed has been running a number of campaigns around the budget itself. You can join the Budget Justice Coalition. There are a lot of initiatives of people trying to make the budget more fair. And it's about how do we leverage those existing frameworks. But if people are interested also in saying, as Busi from wherever, I want to make a submission to Parliament to say I don't agree with this budget, the Parliamentary Monitoring Group, PMG, is a very good resource. So I'd actually encourage people to go there and see what they show, because that's where you can fundamentally learn about, what is available to you, what information is available to you, and how to participate. And I think it's about empowering people to participate, actually, but then again, the other work is also to make that participation meaningful. So one of the things we've been, arguing about is to say, yes, we've got this participatory mechanisms, but are you really listening? We've been saying government is implementing austerity since 2018. Since 2018, if you say, this is not going to work, this is terrible. And here we are, and we're still saying the same thing, right? So fundamentally, it's really as well about creating more participatory places, and that means challenging them. I think as young people in South Africa, we really just have to challenge in a different way and think creatively. I mean, I was thinking, it's COVID, you can't protest, so it's like you have to think differently about how do we organize and fundamentally hold our government to account on many things, ask them questions. They must respond to us, one of my burning questions now is, why is it that the speech announced a corporate tax cut, but the budget review didn't say anything, right? Sure. So these are questions we must ask, and we must, we want the answers fundamentally. But yeah, I think fundamentally people walk away with anything is we must be a collective, and it actually starts at the local government level. I've been saying to people, what would happen if all the young people in our country analyzed the municipal budgets? We all checked our municipalities to see how much they were allocated. Yep. Did they spend that money? That is something you can do, even as an individual. That information can be available. And so it's also about bottom up. It's we can fight how much is being allocated at the top, but also we've got a key job as citizens to uphold our municipals to delivering what, is supposed to be happening on the ground, fundamentally. So that's one challenge I give to people who are watching this.
Great.
Do you know what your municipal is allocating? Do you know how they're spending that money? And how do you make sure they spend the money that they're supposed to spend in the ways they're supposed to spend it?
Thank you, Busi. I think that's a great way to end. I love the challenge. We are also putting out links to all of the kind of mechanisms where you can get involved, that Busi mentions. You can just follow the Capital on our social media pages. We'll share them now, and we'll reshare them in the coming days. And then I love that challenge. I think we often, in these big conversations of youth unemployment, national budgets, you sitting there as an individual watching this on Facebook, is like, oh, how can I ever tackle this like all-consuming huge problem? But I think to realize that if we create a culture in government of accountability, that can start at your municipality, as Busi says. A culture of people are going to hold you to account. This is actually our money. We pay taxes, through the food we buy and fuel levy tax, the taxi fares we spend. We contribute to the tax base. We are entitled to basic services, as Busi has said time and time again. And the budget should really work for us. And that starts in your community, and then holding National Treasury account as part of that. But let's start somewhere, and let's take on Busi's challenge. So thank you to everybody for tuning in today. Thank you again to Busi for your time. It's been amazing. I have personally learned so much, so I feel a lot more equipped to speak about the budget now. So thank you. And I'm sure we'll reach out to you again in the future for future conversations. But thanks so much. Any closing remarks before we say goodbye?
No, that's all. No, thank you to everyone. And I really hope we should make this a real challenge, like a national challenge.
I love it.
I think the last word is to say that to empower people to say that, there's a quote that says economics is far too important to be left to economists. It's deeply important.
Yeah.
In times like this, for people to understand that you have a voice, and your voice in economics is important, whether you've studied economics or not, and that economics by design is to exclude the average person from engaging with it. And so we have to fight that. We have to insert ourselves, even if we don't know, we must insert ourselves in the conversations, because it's our economy. We are workers in this economy. We are consumers in this economy. Economies are made up of people. They're not made up of invisible things and businesses. They're made up of people. And so it's important that we all, are a part of, that we continuously learn, that we continuously aspire to learn. I'm continuously learning, to be able to participate in these conversations and to show up.
Thanks so much, Busi, and thanks to everybody for tuning in today. Please keep following us on social media for follow-up conversations or future discussions around the budget and the impact. Cheers, everyone.